Hey everyone, and welcome. You know that old saying, let food be thy medicine? It sounds great, but how much science is really behind it? Well, today's entire explainer was sparked by a fantastic question from one of you that gets right to the heart of that idea, all focused on one single food, the mighty mushroom. So let's dive right in. So this all comes from Elton. Elton is a 71-year-old stroke survivor, and he tells us he has low LDL, that's the bad cholesterol, but high LPA, which is another risk factor for heart issues. And he's not just sitting back, he's taking action. Every single day, he adds about a quarter cup of uncooked, diced king oyster mushrooms to his salad. So his question for us is, what's the real science on this? Are there any big population studies on the benefits for your heart, your brain, and for cancer? It's such a brilliant and specific question. So for Elton, and really for all of us, let's break it down.
Okay, but first, we gotta get the really serious, important stuff out of the way. We need to be crystal clear. We are not doctors. We're not medical professionals. This is all for informational purposes. It is absolutely not, under any circumstances, a substitute for professional medical advice. Please always talk to your own physician. They are your #1 resource. All right, with that covered, let's tackle the first part of Elton's question. Heart health. As a stroke survivor, this is obviously a top priority for him. So, what does the research actually say about oyster mushrooms and your cardiovascular system? The whole conversation really begins with this one key player, a compound called beta-glucan. The easiest way to think about it is as a special type of soluble fiber that's packed inside the mushroom's cell walls. When you eat it, the bacteria in your gut basically have a little party. They ferment it, and that process can actually signal to your body to slow down its own cholesterol production. And get this, oyster mushrooms are loaded with beta-glucans. We're talking about twice as many as you'd find in the common white button mushrooms. So that's the theory. But what happens when we look at actual human trials? Well, this is where things get really interesting because it's kind of a good news, bad news story. A big 2020 review that looked at 8 different human trials found some pretty awesome stuff. It linked oyster mushroom intake to lower triglycerides, lower cholesterol, and lower blood pressure. Sounds incredible, right? But, and this is a huge but, the researchers themselves waved a big red flag. They pointed out that the studies had a high risk of bias and that the overall quality of the evidence was pretty low. Their conclusion? We need more, better designed studies to be sure. So we've got a really promising signal here, but it's not a slam dunk. Not yet. Okay, now let's switch gears and move on to the second part of Elton's question, cancer risk. This is where the headlines can get really splashy, which means it's also where we have to be extra careful and put on our critical thinking caps. So a massive meta-analysis out of Penn State, we're talking 17 studies with over 19,000 cancer patients, came up with a number that just makes you go, whoa. They found that higher mushroom consumption was associated with a 45% lower risk of cancer. Yeah, 45%. And here is the kicker, especially for Elton. What does higher consumption even mean? Well, the amount linked to that incredible 45% number was just 18 grams a day. You know what that is? That's about 1/8 to 1/4 of a cup. It's almost the exact amount that Elton is eating every single day. That correlation is just incredible. But, okay, before we all run out and build a diet entirely of mushrooms, we need to pump the brakes and look a little closer. That 45% number comes from observing large groups of people. When scientists try to figure out why that might be happening, a lot of the research is done in a lab, in petri dishes. And sure, in the lab, oyster mushroom extracts have been shown to fight all sorts of cancer cells. But, and I really cannot stress this enough, what happens in a petri dish is a million miles from what happens inside a complex, living, breathing human body. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Let's look at a quote from one of the most respected cancer centers on the planet, Memorial Sloan Kettering. They put it bluntly, oyster mushroom has not been shown to treat cancer in humans. This is so important. It separates the promising idea of risk reduction from the totally unproven idea of it being a treatment. They are not the same thing. And that brings us to what might be the most important part of any scientific investigation, being honest about what we don't know. It's so easy to get carried away with the exciting stuff, but addressing the gaps is absolutely critical. Remember, Elton didn't just ask about heart disease and cancer. He also asked about brain health and longevity. For a stroke survivor, that's not just some curious question. It's deeply personal. Can mushrooms protect the brain? Can they help us live longer? And the straightforward, honest answer is, we don't really know. Based on the comprehensive sources we're using for this explainer, the big population studies on oyster mushrooms and their direct effect on brain health or longevity just aren't there yet.
Now, that doesn't mean a benefit doesn't exist. It just means the research hasn't established it. And we're committed to sticking to what the data actually shows us today.
So, after all that, looking at the heart research, the cancer research, and acknowledging the gaps in our knowledge, what's the big takeaway here?
How do we wrap this all up and answer Elton's question?
It really all boils down to this one simple concept: promise versus proof. On the promise side, we've got some very exciting findings. Mushrooms may lower some heart disease risk factors. Big observational studies link mushroom eating to a lower cancer risk. And we know for a fact that they're a nutritional powerhouse. But then you have to look at the proof side, and that's where you see the scientific caution. The human studies on heart health are limited, the amazing cancer results are mostly in the lab. And most importantly, mushrooms are not and should not be seen as a substitute for proven medical treatments. So where does that leave us? Well, here's the bottom line. While we wait for the scientists to do more research, oyster mushrooms are, without a doubt, a nutritious, healthy, low-calorie food. And for Elton, who's eating them raw, it's great to know that oyster mushrooms are considered one of the best varieties to eat uncooked. For the rest of us, they're just incredibly versatile. You can toss them into soups, pastas, sauces, omelets, pretty much anything. They're simply a fantastic part of a healthy, balanced diet. Which leaves us with one final big question. Here we have this delicious, nutritious food that is just full of incredible potential. The science is exciting and it's pointing in a really positive direction. But can we call it medicine? Based on the evidence we have right now, the answer has to be not yet. A huge thank you to Elton for sending in such a specific and thoughtful question that let us explore all of this. It's a great reminder for all of us to stay curious, but also to stay critical. Thanks for tuning in.